All right. Well, welcome to STAT's virtual event. 4 FDA commissioners discuss the future. Thanks for joining us. I'm Matthew Herper. I'm the senior writer of medicine and editorial director of events here at STAT. And I think I skipped that this is sponsored by Real Chemistry. Before we start, a few quick housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see several icons. Use the chat feature to chat amongst yourselves or to send a message directly to the STAT team, which appears at STAT events. Please don't put your questions for the panelists in the chat. If you do have a question that you would like to ask, and I hope you do, please use the Q&A feature to type your question and we'll try to answer it. In the Q&A window, you should also be able to see the questions other attendees ask and upvote the ones you'd like. I will pay attention to which questions are upvoted the most. We will be taking questions throughout the chat, so please don't wait until the end to submit. This is part of what makes these events unique. Thanks again to all of you for being here. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome Jim Weiss, founder and CEO of Real Chemistry, for a sponsored introduction of today's event. Take it away, Jim.
Are you ready? Thank you, Matt, and welcome everyone. In the spirit of driving home just how quickly our world is changing, I'd like to start with some breaking news of our own. Earlier this week, we announced that W2O, which is how you know us, you heard the word Real Chemistry, the firm I launched 20 years ago, is now Real Chemistry, a global health innovation company. Real Chemistry is the next generation of my vision to make the world a healthier place for all. Real Chemistry is the new way we're approaching the health ecosystem of the future. It will be people-centric, outcomes-oriented, and digitally connected. Those of you on today's call know more than anyone the challenges and needs facing our industry and how we need to work differently. Just look at the way we all came together this past year to defeat COVID and the amazing impact we had for people around the world. It's this kind of coming together that Real Chemistry is all about, working across disciplines, services, and solutions, informed by data and proprietary technologies, propelled by powerful creative storytelling. Real Chemistry enables us to meet our clients where they are, to deliver the most complete corporate, clinical, and commercial solutions to have a greater impact and improve health outcomes. But I know you're not here to hear me wax on about Real Chemistry. I'm just the appetizer for today's amazing session led by senior stat writer and healthcare influencer, Matt Herper. During the session, Matt will go deep with 4 former FDA commissioners, Rob Kaliff, Scott Gottlieb, Peggy Hamburg, and Jane Henney. Before we get started, I thought I'd share a little relevant FDA history. I'm a huge history buff and find that understanding the past always helps me think about the future more effectively. Some of you may know this already, but a case could be made that the first FDA commissioner was a man named Louis Caleb Beck, hired around 1848 by the US government to conduct chemical investigations for the Agricultural Division in the Patent Office of the Department of the Interior. Equally interesting is the fact that in 1901, one of the predecessors to the FDA was the Bureau of Chemistry. And then in 1927, the Bureau of Chemistry became the United States Food and Drug and Insecticide Administration. Although it was not known by its present name until 1930, the FDA's current regulatory functions started with the passage of the 1906 Pure Food and Drugs Act, a law 25 years in the making that prohibited interstate commerce in adulterated and misbranded food and drugs. The FDA was the driving force behind this law and headed its enforcement in the early years, providing basic elements of protection that consumers had never known before that time. And now for a little data. In prep for today's event, we looked at least the last 12 months of Twitter updates using our California Life Sciences Association dashboard. In the 7,000 conversations where FDA and vaccines were mentioned, chatter was nearly non-existent until the announcements of the EAUs of the Pfizer and Moderna COVID vaccines when volumes spiked precipitously. These conversations were largely positive and saw support from both the left and the right. It's also worth pointing out that as someone who's worked with numerous times with the FDA over the last 30 years, the organization actually deserves some serious kudos for what they accomplished during a once in 100 years pandemic. We should all be advocating for greater investment in the agency, as there's nothing more important than our health, and the FDA can be a partner to our industry if we work with them in the right way to advance the cause. I learned that early on in my career at Genentech in the 1990s, where I saw executives in different parts of the organization working with the FDA to create new standards in clinical trials, manufacturing, distribution, and marketing, learning from both our successes and some of our mistakes. And that as a backdrop, let me just say how proud Real Chemistry is to underwrite this session brought to you by STAT, an outlet that has become synonymous with trust, a torchbearer for science, and a leader in breaking healthcare news. That brings us to today's session. Some of the topics Matt will touch on today during his conversation include lessons from COVID-19, advice for the next FDA commissioner, tobacco and opioids, and the FDA as a standalone agency. During the session, I'm also looking forward to hearing about the agency's need for hiring and retaining strong talent. Over the last several years, this dearth of talent has led to a significant backlog in the agency's caseload, which impacts every industry regulated by the FDA. A focus on maternal health and child nutrition, two areas where racial disparities in healthcare continue to rear their ugly heads, and the importance of naming a qualified commissioner, one of the most critical appointments that President Biden will make during his tenure. So get ready to hear from 5 of the smartest people on the planet. Thank you again, STAT, for the honor of allowing me to introduce this groundbreaking session. Back to you, Matt.
All right. Thank you, Jim. For the editorial portion of today's event, I'll be joined by 4 former FDA commissioners. Please welcome Dr. Robert Kaliff, the head of clinical policy and strategy for Verily and Google Health, an adjunct professor at Duke University and Stanford University. Dr. Scott Gottlieb, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Peggy Hamburg, vice president for global biological programs and policy at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, interim. And Dr. Jane Henney, voluntary professor in the Department of Population Health at the University of Kansas School of Medicine. Thanks so much to all of you for being here. It's a thrill to do this session. I told you as we were preparing that I do listen to our viewers. There are a lot of them, and there are already 32 questions in that Q&A tab I told you not to look at. But the first one is actually very close to the top one, I should say, is something very close to something I wanted to ask you about. And I wanted to start with, you all signed a letter dated March 9th, urging President Biden to prioritize securing an FDA commissioner. Jane, let's start with you. Why is it important to get a commissioner quickly? And are you surprised we don't have one yet?
I'm not actually surprised that we don't have one yet. I think we all went through our own process and difficulties in the nomination and confirmation process. It's long and arduous. But I do feel like it's important for the nominee to be named soon. I think we wrote the letter for a couple of reasons to emphasize the need for a nominated and confirmed commissioner. We all sat in that chair. It's a very challenging job, and it's challenging even when you have the support of a nomination from the president and a confirmation from the Senate. And Janet's being willing to take this on as an acting, we all wanted her to know that we supported in this, knowing that the job is even more difficult when you are in an acting position. And in addition to all of the day-to-day work of the agency, which is challenging in and of itself, she's dealing in the environment of this pandemic. So we felt it important to emphasize to the president the need to get on with the nomination process and to provide Janet our sincere support, because she provided us support, every one of us, during our times as commissioner.
Did any of the rest of you have any thoughts on the letter or on Janet, who was mentioned in the letter, but it didn't specifically advocate for her nomination? Peggy?
Well, I think it's very important that the FDA get an official commissioner. The process, as Jane said, of being vetted and formally nominated by the president, then confirmed by the Senate, is a lengthy one. And the longer there's a period of uncertainty, I think the worse it is for the FDA and its internal morale and activities. This has been a challenging time, and it's always challenging to work there. But in addition, the FDA is such a central partner in the activities that are essential to controlling the COVID crisis, but so fundamental to every aspect of really our lives, our health, and our well-being. You know, FDA is a very unique and essential agency, and people undervalue it, but it matters so much. And industry, for example, really can't tolerate the uncertainty either. So I think that we really need to move forward. I think we don't want to get out in front of the president's prerogative to choose and nominate a commissioner. I also think we don't yet have a confirmed HHS secretary, and the chemistry of the relationship between the FDA commissioner and the HHS secretary is important. As an FDA commissioner, you want the secretary to be invested in you and support you. So I think maybe now things are starting to align, if the HHS secretary is confirmed soon, so that, you know, perhaps we will have a formal nomination, you know, in the not too distant future. That's certainly my hope.
Scott, and I should note, Thomas CO, one of our, in that most upvoted question, is asking, if you were Joe Biden, knowing what you know, who would you appoint as commissioner? So I'll throw out the big question, but if you don't want to quite take that head on, Scott, what would your do you have more thoughts on the need? I mean, we are seeing investors starting to blame every FDA decision on the lack of a commissioner, and well, the FDA is toughening up for this or that reason.
Yeah, well, look, I'll take it head on. I think Janet's going to be very strong in the acting role. She's not an ordinary acting commissioner in terms of her ability to operate in that role. She knows the agency very well, and you've seen the agency be very aggressive even in this interim period. I mean, they put out the guidance on the new variant. She's taken enforcement actions against CBD, on opioid issues, on issues related to fraudulent COVID products. I think you're going to see other policy coming out of the agency. They took some action recently on contaminants in baby foods, and I think she's going to be an active, aggressive acting commissioner. I think she'd be an outstanding commissioner of the agency, and I think the administration should give thought to nominating her permanently into the role. But yeah, I think the agency, you know, during these interim periods, sometimes the agency is at a little bit of a disadvantage, and there are benefits that come with Senate confirmation. There are benefits with coming with a fully nominated FDA commissioner. But I think Janet's going to be as good as you can get in the acting role here. In terms of just the scuttlebutt around some recent FDA decisions, I mean, you know, I don't put a lot of credence into that kind of speculation that suddenly there's a change in regulatory decision-making around drug approvals because of a change in leadership of the agency. I mean, the agency does change its orientation over time with respect to regulatory decisions, but it unfolds so gradually and through successive guidance documents and public meetings. You don't see a rapid evolution or change in the agency's overall posture to risk benefit. I mean, outside of maybe certain episodes in history, Vioxx obviously had an impact on the agency around certain classes of drugs. You've seen sort of isolated events like that. But to think that because there's an acting commissioner, because Janet's moved from CEDAR into the front office, that somehow there's a change in the overall orientation of the agency around risk and benefit, I don't buy it. And I will tell you that, I would sometimes, when I was in the job, I often found out about review decisions by reading stat or by reading a publication. I mean, you actually don't know about these things in advance unless it's something important. Like Kimria, I knew about weeks in advance. You get briefed on certain decisions, but most of the time you're reading about regulatory actions on specific products in the press. And sometimes when you all were writing about some decision that must indicate that the pendulum has shifted, occasionally I would ask the center director about it, or sort of look at it out of curiosity of what was going on, just for my own edification to learn. And invariably, it was always a product specific issue. Like there wasn't some kind of change. It wasn't that we changed our philosophy around risk tolerance here, or there's been some global change in policy. There was something very specific that wasn't being revealed. And, people on the outside were sort of deriving broad conclusions from it. So I'd be careful about drawing conclusions that things have changed because, the agency has an acting commissioner and Janet is no longer in CEDAR.
You have anything to add, Rob?
I'll be brief and just reemphasize 2 points. Number one, I think Janet's courage is underestimated by anyone who says the agency is doing something because there's only an acting commissioner. You may not always agree with Janet, but there is no doubt you will know what she thinks and it will be explicit. So to the extent the commissioner affects things, I don't think you could pick a better acting, and I think she'd make a great commissioner. Now, it's obviously up to the administration and not our job to promote any individual person for this job. And then the second thing to emphasize, I really feel strongly that, there is a misunderstanding. Scott said it well, but I'll just reemphasize it. The commissioner shouldn't be making decisions about individual products. The commissioner is there to help develop policies that may impact things over time, but those decisions are made by center directors and their staff, as it should be. Commissioner is
a very strong stand on that position.
I had to face a very tough situation with that, which I'm still being criticized for. But you know what? It doesn't bother me at all, because I think the process is so critical to the well-being of both the public and the industry that full-time civil servants make those decisions, not a political appointee. The commissioner's job is to protect the civil service from all these political considerations that come up. And then there is an occasional situation, I know Peggy had one, where it does get up to the commissioner to play a role, but that should only be done in extraordinarily rare situations.
But I think one has to underscore, though, that the commissioner has a critical role in supporting the importance of science-based decision-making, advocating for the needs of the agency in terms of support for its scientific capabilities and agenda, and really representing that to both the public and policymakers.
And to the internal staff, I would ask, because the staff is also reading stat very often to find out what's going on inside the FDA. Yeah. And the commissioner, can really do a lot for the staff if that public advocacy role is played
Only
well.
The articles that aren't paywall, though, because you can't get to the ones that are.
Yeah, I should note, this is an underwritten session, but we're not getting paid. I just want to make that clear to people that might have wondered about.
I always start reading the stat articles. I can't get past the first sentence because the rest of it's.
Well, come on, Scott. You should have a subscription.
I should. I gotta get one.
There was actually my colleague Adam Feuerstein asked me to ask you guys this morning about one of these cases that people are reading tea leaves about, which is and not about the specific case, since you're all commissioners and don't deal with specific products, but a bunch of the PD-1 inhibitors are going up to panel again for potentially losing an indication that was granted under accelerated approval. And we were wondering if any of you have thoughts on how well the accelerated approval process is working.
Well, Matt, I got to say, one of the tenets of accelerated approval is that you are taking a greater risk, that the benefits may not outweigh the risks when the post-market studies are done. And I don't think it's a sign of a failed function if, when something is proven not to work, it is rescinded. That's been, people have wondered whether the FDA will be able to make that happen. But it's clearly a trade-off. If you're making a decision based on surrogate endpoints, there's a lot at stake, and you need those good post-market studies.
Yeah, man, I would just echo that. I think that an indication of a healthy process and of the accelerated approval process functioning very well is the willingness of the division to bring products back for review and re-adjudication if they don't succeed in the post-market studies that are the conditions of approval for the accelerated approval. So the fact that the agency is willing to do that, even in tough settings, I think shows that the process does work. And they've done that in recent years. You've seen other situations where they've re-adjudicated an indication granted under accelerated approval when the confirmatory studies didn't confirm the benefit.
I was commissioner when the Avastin decision was made, and Rob quietly referenced that earlier this session, in that ultimately the decision came down to me, and it was the one true regulatory product approval or disapproval decision that I actually made. But that was one where there was an expanded indication that had been approved using accelerated approval, and the follow-up data didn't support that, and we did take that approval away. And I think it sent a very important message that we were, serious about this pathway, and it meant it actually was going to do what we had said the pathway was about, which was to try to accelerate, but on the best available data, continue to collect data, and take further actions as indicated. I think the one issue that remains for the FDA and needs to be taken seriously is to really ensure that the follow-up studies are getting done, and that ongoing oversight is continued. And I think it's just another area where we have to make sure that FDA has the resources and support to fully achieve the goals of that important program and other programs as well.
Jane, do you have a thought on accelerated approval which you didn't have to deal with in the same?
Well,
way?
I'm so old that accelerated approval came around during my time. So watching it work has been very interesting. But, from the very beginning, the concept was to make decisions that needed to be made early, but having the ability to pull something back was always a concept built into the structure of accelerated approval.
So I want to move on to the topic that I think I've gotten the most questions on for this. Anybody want to guess? It's actually tobacco. Someone wrote it in, the nation has watched in horror over the last year as more than 500,000 people have died as the result of a deadly disease, cigarette addiction. And I think that was from Jared Kozil. We have from Jamie Caracciolo, and the part of these is watching me mess up the names. Why wouldn't there be a nicotine mandate to non-additive levels to help our health system reduce costs? And it is also George Garcia Baldret asks, why is it taking so long to focus on a nicotine mandate in combustible cigarettes? So I thought you all might have some thoughts on that. I can keep going to the many questions we're getting on it, but they seem to hit a common theme.
Well, Matt, as you know, we put forward a nicotine standard and we put nicotine at the center of our regulatory efforts to try to reduce the death and disease from tobacco by recognizing that nicotine was a substance that sustained addiction to tobacco. The death and disease from tobacco wasn't necessarily a function of nicotine, but nicotine was a substance that sustained people on combustible tobacco products. And so by regulating nicotine levels in combustible tobacco to render tobacco products minimally or non-addictive, we could end death and disease from tobacco. We could substantially reduce addiction to combustible tobacco products. That product standard was put forward in a notice of proposed rulemaking. The NPRM went forward. It was never obviously displayed. I think the regulatory process that was set in motion should be continued, and I'm hopeful it will be continued under this administration. I think certainly if a Republican administration can begin a process to regulate nicotine in combustible tobacco, I suspect it's going to be taken forward by a Democratic administration. And at the same time that we did that, we saw opportunities for non-combustible products to offer an alternative, a less harmful alternative, not risk-free, but a less harmful alternative for currently addicted adult smokers who still wanted to enjoy satisfying levels of nicotine, but no longer could get it through products of combustion. So if you were going to take nicotine out of combustible products, you had to offer some alternative for people who still want access to nicotine. It's a legal substance. And so we pushed very hard to try to create new pathways for medicinal nicotine products. I think that's very important. There's ways that you can improve delivery, improve speed of delivery, to allow medicinal nicotine products sold over the counter or even by prescription to be more satisfying to currently addicted adult smokers and help them transition off of combustible products. We also saw the vaping products as one potential alternative. I think the challenges there with respect to the youth addiction to nicotine through those non-combustible products really set back that opportunity for currently addicted adult smokers substantially. But there probably is still an opportunity to use those products, medicinal nicotine products, as an alternative for adult smokers once you regulate nicotine in the combustible products. But I'll just sort of close by saying I think it's going to be important to have that dual approach, that when you're going forward with a process to regulate nicotine in the combustible products, to take nicotine out of those products or take them down to levels that no longer can sustain addiction, offering some alternative to currently addicted adult smokers is going to be an important part of that overall regulatory approach.
And Matt, if I can jump in, I think that the tobacco issue, I agree with Scott that this needs to be high on the FDA agenda. And it's a reminder that FDA really does have these broad responsibilities that really matter. Tobacco and food safety and nutrition, they sometimes get forgotten, especially in forums like this that are more focused on the medical product side of the house. But also, I think it's a really good example of the continuity that occurs in the agency that's driven by its mission of promoting and protecting health, regardless of who's in the commissioner's chair, and also, at times whether they're acting or confirmed. David Kessler really began the fight around tobacco and established the sort of concept that FDA could regulate and should regulate tobacco products. That ended up not being achieved because of some court battles, and a transition occurred. Then when the Obama administration came in soon thereafter, there was bipartisan passage of the bill that gave FDA the authority to regulate tobacco. And of course, we stood up the Tobacco Center and embarked on a lot of really important activities to begin to really address, this terrible toll taken by tobacco and tobacco product use, including laying out an agenda that included the idea of lowering nicotine in cigarettes. We were delighted when we saw that Scott, now FDA commissioner, in his leadership in that role, embraced those elements of what we had put forward, despite the fact that, as he noted, it was a Republican administration now, and much of the groundwork had been laid in a Democratic administration. I think it was unfortunate that it didn't get a chance to move forward after Scott formalized the discussion, at least, around actually beginning to lower nicotine. Now is the time, given the persistent toll taken by tobacco in this country and around the world, and the opportunities to make a difference, for us not just to pursue that important element, but to really address a whole range of issues that FDA now is empowered to act on.
Yeah. And, Matt, I just want to follow up on one point Peggy made, which was very good, but I want to give Rob and Jane a chance to comment before I do, but there is one point I want to follow up on, if I can.
Jane, I do have a couple of things to say. I'll try to be brief, but Jane, go ahead.
Well, I think whether in the office or out of the office, many of us have been working on this issue of tobacco and tobacco regulation for some time. Peggy gave a wonderful history going back to the time that David took this as an initiative. And I was deputy commissioner at that time. As I came into the chair is when we were in the Supreme Court, actually. And then it's been very satisfying to watch Scott as he moved into the office to again take up the mantle. I think that the agency has a number of, clearly has work yet to do. But I think regardless of who's in the chair, that there will be another push to get these products regulated. Over to
Yeah,
you.
Matt, I got to, I'm a cardiologist from North Carolina.
Mhm.
Spent most of my early career caring for people with heart attacks that were tobacco induced primarily. At the time, it was mostly men in their 50s who were heavy smokers. And so it's gruesome to have observed it. And then, the next comment, just 3 quick points to make. The next comment is, I think tobacco use is becoming one of the most important markers of disparities in our economy and our healthcare system. If you look now at the epidemiology of who uses tobacco products, it's very much centered in people that are low income and not as well educated, and who have other medical comorbidities. And so it's remarkable to me that it's been so hard to get the policies through. And, part of that is related to something I know we're going to get to later, which is the relationship between FDA, HHS, and the rest of the political process. This is one issue that plays out in the political process probably like no other has. And the last point I want to make has to do with my current life at Alphabet, where we're working on disease management. And one thing that really surprised me is how hard it is to make the financial case for disease management approaches that help people become unaddicted to nicotine. You'll notice if you look at the market on disease management, there's a lot of diabetes, there's a lot of hypertension, almost nothing on tobacco cessation. And although Scott did enable some pathways, which I was very concerned about too, there was a real disconnect between what FDA was doing in nicotine and tobacco on the Center for Tobacco Products, and then on the drug side where the nicotine replacement products are regulated. So I'm glad the pathways got put in place, but it has not taken off. And the end result is that all the people on this call, I bet no one smokes on this call. Yet if you went to the average, place of employment or to the mental health community, you would find enormous numbers, still 50 million people using tobacco products. And yet there's almost no market for developing therapies that are effective in getting them off of it. So we need a regulatory approach, and I hope that this administration will have the courage to fight what will be tough battles. I've never seen more capable or nastier lawyers than what I experienced in trying to deal with the tobacco industry. It was awesome
That Rob was
and quite frightening for public health.
Should note there that Rob was a clinical trialist for many years, dealing with pharmaceutical companies. So.
Matt, Peggy made a point about the importance of continuity in policymaking at the agency. And I think that's a really important point, because the time frame for the implementation of policy at FDA can sometimes be very long when you're going through a legislative process and then going through prolonged rulemaking to try to implement complex regulations. A lot of these things aren't going to get done in 2, maybe even a 4-year time horizon. It's going to transcend administrations from time to time. But when you're dealing with fundamental issues of public health that have bipartisan support, and by and large, legislative issues around the FDA and even regulatory issues have bipartisan support, and this had strong bipartisan support, I think it's very important for administrations to respect the work that's in process. And as leadership turns over, things that are in process, there's continuity to that. I will tell you, right before I got, you will remember this, right before I got voted on by the Senate, the administration had cut a deal with the cigar industry in litigation that was going on. Some HHS attorneys had cut a deal with the cigar industry to stay litigation, where the agency was being sued to basically nullify the deeming rule, which hadn't yet gone into effect. It was about to go into effect, and there was a deal cut for a 3-month stay in that litigation. And the press reported it at the time. The Washington Post reported it that, the administration must be looking to their new FDA commissioner to come in and pull that rule. And so they're giving him 3 months to do it. I wasn't yet in the job. I hadn't even been voted on by the Senate. And that was a very big fight when I landed at the FDA, because I made clear that there was no way that I was going to pull the DME reg. It had a deep administrative record. It was the product of bipartisan legislation. It had gone through a careful process, and we were going to implement that rule. And we were going to follow the outlines of the policy that had been set in motion. The secretary supported me, Price, but it ended up being, something that I had to litigate literally my first day on the job. That's why I always tell the story that the first meeting I took was with Mitch Zeller, the head of the Tobacco Center. That's why, because things were in limbo when I landed. But it was important, in my view, to have that continuity in policymaking. So I think Peggy makes an excellent point. I think it's a sort of a lesson for anyone who finds themselves in that role, and in any regulatory agency for that matter. But I think FDA is unique in that regard, that continuity has been respected over time.
Okay.
Speaking of continuity, Matt,
Yeah.
I just be noted, the story about Mitch. I mean, Mitch and Jane were both there when Kessler, got the credit, but Mitch and Jane were doing a lot of the work, and here Mitch is still now fighting the good fight.
You're losing control of the panel, Matt.
I told you that's okay.
We could just take over.
Well, I wonder a little bit about how much control I should exert, because this is all great. I did want to, there are two other things I want to get to after this question. We got about 20 minutes. So I wonder if this next one could just be a straw poll, which is from Jared Seehofer. Given the political infighting between HHS and FDA last year and how it may have impacted FDA's ability to achieve its mission, would you support making FDA an independent federal agency?
Yes.
Yes, although for many other reasons besides the one that you just stated.
We'll come back and you can tick them off quickly. Rob?
Yeah, I would say yes, but there's a long discussion about exactly what independent means, because nothing in the federal government is going to be entirely independent. But yes, to the basic concept.
Independent of HHS, I think, is what is meant there. Scott?
Yeah, and I agree with what Peggy said. There's a lot of complicated reasons why I think this would be sound policymaking.
Peggy, do you want to give us some of the other reasons quickly?
Well, I think, one reason is broader than just the relationship with HHS. It's to protect the agency from intrusions of politics or ideology or other vested interests. FDA has to work with and make decisions that affect a very broad range of constituents. And I think you don't want it structured in a way where they're always having to fight off unwanted and harmful influence and intrusion. In addition, you want an FDA that's as nimble and streamlined and swift as possible in its decision-making apparatus. And having to go through these various stages of review and sign-off for a whole lot of the activities of FDA, it really does slow down the process in ways that are unnecessary. And it also does, of course, open up more opportunities for those kinds of intrusions as well. I really do think that in addition, FDA would be benefited by being not just removed from HHS, but really exist like an FCC or an FTC or an SEC. Because one of the other things that's challenging at the moment, it isn't the biggest issue, is that FDA within its current framework has to regulate other components of the health and human service community, whether it's NIH or CDC, and has to, sometimes take regulatory actions that are made more complicated because of those relationships. And if it was, fully external, I think it would make for, I think greater independence, stronger focus on mission and the science that drives the ability to achieve its goals and objectives, and would make it a more efficient and responsive agency overall.
Yeah, Matt, I think it could just, like Peggy said, I think it could be like the FCC where it just hits the Domestic Policy Council, reports directly into the White House through the Domestic Policy Council. It doesn't report through HHS. I think the work of the FDA is so specialized. There were very few circumstances where I felt HHS was providing value on our rulemaking or our policy. HHS, more often than not, just functioned as another vehicle for people to try to lobby FDA actions. If they didn't get recourse with FDA, they would go and try to lobby HHS and try to stop things at that level. It really, more often than not, stymied good policy making. I didn't see it adding a lot of value over successive administrations. And it wasn't people specific. It was just institutional, structural.
I want to move on to another one of these long-term issues that all of you dealt with at some level, and also another reference to Dr. Kessler, who keeps coming up. But apparently, according Andrew Kolodny writes that Dr. Kessler said on 60 Minutes that perhaps the FDA should never have allowed long-term use of opioids for chronic pain, that this mistake may have contributed to the opioid crisis. And he asks, do you agree? And if so, do you believe the FDA should narrow the labels? I would broaden that to, how do you folks feel that the FDA is doing in dealing with the opioid crisis, which was driven by prescription drugs, and what, if any what would your advice be to whoever gets nominated and confirmed in dealing with this crisis once we're through COVID?
Well, I'm chair of the board of an addiction program in Dayton, Ohio, which has the highest mortality from drug overdose. So I've learned a lot of on the ground stuff in the last year in perspective. I mean, what I would say, Matt, is the evidence about long-term opioids was never required. And so from that perspective, I would say it was a mistake. The evidence should have been required before extending the label. This was many years ago. And so, there's a long-term history here. So I would say what the current commissioner should do is demand that the evidence be generated for whatever claims are made about opioids, and to go with where the evidence tells them to go. But I would also add, to pigeonhole this as an FDA issue only is just a horrific mistake. I mean, there is so much culpability to go around in every sector that's involved, whether it's the pharma industry that looked the other way or participated in this, whether it's the medical profession, I'm part of it, that every one of these prescriptions had someone who wrote the prescription, and to portray doctors as imbeciles who only go by what sales reps tell them is just flat out wrong. Pharmacists gave out the prescriptions, and the suppliers of pharmacists knew about the high rates of opioid use and didn't blow the whistle or stop it. And a system that puts people in jail for being addicted, I can tell you, in Ohio is just a factory for more addicted people. So, show me an element of society that's not involved. But for sure, the FDA could have done things better. And I think what I would say is demand the evidence to inform the labels.
And I think there's a couple of other areas where FDA can really lean in to make a difference at the broader problem. One is to really help to support and incentivize more products that are treatments for chronic pain. There are many different pathways for chronic pain problems, many different needs. Not all of them are pharmacologic, in terms of treatments that may add benefit. But, let's not act as though all chronic pain has to be treated by opioids or not get treated at all. And I think FDA really could be proactive, working with the research community and companies in that sphere. Similarly, I think we need to continue to advance medical treatment for addiction. And I think that it has been a challenging area to get companies interested in, and to do the studies that need to be done to move products forward, and then to make sure that that people have access to those products. I think that's another arena of activity that really should be pursued. I was pleased that we were able to develop auto-inject Narcan for community use to save lives when overdoses occur. I think our goal is to prevent overdoses from happening in the first place. But I think that kind of technology and approach is also important as we think about this as a multifaceted, comprehensive problem. And of course, as Rob so eloquently delineated, you know, it's not exclusively an FDA problem. It's a broader problem, but we all really have to make sure that we are aligning, you know, all the resources that we have with the magnitude and urgency of the problem as we go forward.
Matt, as a central element of the policymaking that we were trying to pursue, and there was a strong support from the professional staff inside the agency, was that we had to rationalize prescribing. That there was a recognition that a certain number of people who are prescribed opioids for an extended duration of time were going to become addicted, and therefore, from a public health standpoint, you want to make sure the products are being appropriately prescribed and being used only in appropriately indicated patients for the shortest duration possible. That in order to reduce the rates of addiction, we had to rationalize prescribing. And then more importantly, that the agency had an affirmative role to play. The agency had an obligation and a role to take steps to try to rationalize prescribing in the setting, and also had an obligation over the illicit use of the products and looking at how the products were being used illicitly as a component of its public health mission. And there were multiple places where we took extended policies, took actions based on those tenets. And I think it's important that the agency continue with that kind of a paradigm. And they are. You know, Janet's taken regulatory actions in recent weeks against opioids that are being marketed inappropriately. With respect to the issue of chronic administration of the opioids, they were never intended for chronic administration. They were marketed that way, and they were marketed that way in some cases illegally. I mean, you're dealing with a manufacturer that pled guilty to criminal violations for how they were marketing products.
Not just one. Jane,
I think my colleagues have covered the subject well.
So I was going to ask this differently, but it is our most upvoted question. And I think this gets us into the discussion of what my discussion, which was just going to be what we learned from COVID, but I think this is an interesting way to frame it. Even if you guys don't want to directly answer the question. Why has the AstraZeneca vaccine been approved in the UK and 17 plus other countries, but not in the US, asks Daniel Elton. You know, the data noting the real world evidence showing that it is effective in preventing hospitalization. You know, wouldn't lots of people be alive if they had access? Talk a little bit, and maybe Scott, you start here, but what's your perspective on how the FDA has handled these vaccines, and particularly including the ones where we're waiting for the US trials, which would be AstraZeneca and perhaps Novavax?
Look, I think the FDA has done an outstanding job with respect to the development process here. And we focused just on the review process and the AdComs related to these vaccines. And there was an extreme amount of transparency around that aspect of the process with respect to the guidance that the agency put out and also the AdComs. But I think what people have less transparency into is the development process that went on in advance of those applications being filed. And there was a tremendous degree of engagement by CBER with the manufacturers around the development of these vaccines. And there's no question that these development programs wouldn't have gone forward as quickly and as successfully as they did if the agency hadn't been as hands-on as it was. Really a historic level of participation in the process by the agency. And I can sort of say that from the perspective of having been on the other side of the wall. With respect to the AstraZeneca vaccine, I don't really have a good perspective on the agency's decision-making and the process around that, other than to say, just generally speaking, I think when it comes to a product that's treating an infectious disease where you have variants in the nature of the disease as it's being expressed in different countries, you have different variants in different regions of the world, I think regulatory authorities are going to want some data from inside their country. They're going to want a clinical trial that's conducted inside their country because the disease may be slightly different. And we've seen that, what the disease in South Africa is different than the disease in the UK, which is different than the disease in the US. And there may be convergence over time between the variants, but there isn't convergence right now. So you're going to want a definitive trial, I think, conducted in your own country before the agency is going to be comfortable licensing a vaccine. That's my hunch, but I don't know the details of the individual deliberations here.
Jane, what do you think about the way the FDA has handled the vaccine issues? Obviously, this was there were a very different set of worries before we saw the data, when people were afraid that things were going to get approved on potentially very little data.
Well, looking back over this past year, it's been remarkable to have even 2 very effective vaccines approved in this amount of time. And I think we really need to appreciate that these vaccines were developed on the shoulders of 10 years or more of underlying basic science. But my take on what happened during the course of the year, certainly everybody put their shoulders to the wheel to try to find a vaccine. And as Scott has mentioned, the agency working very closely with industry, NIH's involvement, all of those were good things. But I think we all felt this tremendous worry that the agency was going to be pushed to do something or use an EUA when it was inappropriate. And so the milestones along where the agency started taking stronger stands about, what guidance, how effective the vaccine would have to be in order to gain an EUA approval was important. I think the guidance and guidelines that came around in the fall were important for establishing that the agency wasn't going to use different rules in their review. And then I think the agency using basically a webinar to do the advisory committee, and people being able to see the process in real time. I think that folks still don't appreciate that the agency used the exact same review process that they do for every product, where they review independently all the data and give their recommendation to the advisory committee, as well as the company providing their data. All of that taking place in real time, I think, gave more confidence that these products were going to be safe for people to use. It concerns me that there still is this notion of vaccines being harmful above and beyond those for COVID, but surrounding the COVID vaccines too. And we simply have to find a way to get at this fear factor that people have and dispel this notion that these products didn't go through a standard review, albeit it's for an emergency use. It's not full approval yet.
Peggy?
Well, just to add 2 additional thoughts to the sort of comprehensive and I think, very important points made by Scott and Jane. I think that the success in advancing the vaccine process reflected the fact that FDA really was a full partner in the effort, really helping to shape the clinical studies, being, very flexible without abandoning scientific rigor, and thinking about how to make sure that the critical questions got asked and answered, making sure that the clinical trials were done in ways that were realistic, but not overly cumbersome. And I think that really was important. It's a lesson that I think many of us have learned already in terms of how FDA functions best, but that kind of early and continuing engagement to really try to make the process as swift and efficient as possible. I also think the global engagement amongst regulatory authorities proved very important in responding to the COVID vaccine issues. They started meeting, regulatory authorities from around the world started meeting in the very early days to talk about what were going to be the critical issues in vaccine development, and talking about the different categories of vaccine as well. And sort of really, brought together the best science from whichever regulatory authorities and experiences they could find to think about the problem and start to shape frameworks for action. And then have been working together to try to address strategies in key areas, including the important questions now of variants.
I want to ask you from a different perspective. What if you thought of these trials as a clinical trialist?
Oh, I mean, first of all,
I could ask who's done trials as big.
let me just say, first of all, two aphorisms came to mind based on the previous discussion. One is what I used to always tell fellows in training. If you're not being criticized, you're not doing anything worthwhile. And I mean, holy smokes, who could, to criticize the vaccine development, it's always good to make things better, but who would have ever expected we'd have 3 vaccines, a quarter of the adult population already vaccinated, and the safety is just remarkable and the efficacy. So it's kind of funny to me. And the second, everyone else must bring data, which is a key element of the FDA. So when it comes to the AstraZeneca vaccine, it'll be interesting when when we can look under the hood to see what caused the delay in the U.S. compared with other countries, whether it was just the U.S. trial, as Scott mentioned. But as you know, there are products that have been approved without any U.S. patients enrolled in other arenas. So it'll be interesting to see. But I think the data will speak for themselves. In terms of the trials, they were magnificent. And I think the question is to ask the other question, which is why don't we do all the trials the way the vaccine trials were done, with rapid enrollment, efficient data collection, attention to the things that are most important, and not wasting our time and money on elements of clinical trials that are completely useless but take up a lot of the current expense. So if you compare the therapeutic side of the COVID experience to the vaccine, it's like night and day. We're going to come out with a review of all the COVID trials shortly from clinicaltrials.gov. And let me tell you, most of the energy is going to trials that couldn't possibly answer a meaningful question. So we have to fix the non-vaccine part of therapeutic trials.
Yeah, Matt, just to pick up on that
number
point,
were hydroxychloroquine.
Just
because I did that work. I did a story on that this summer. So
Matt, just quickly on that point, I mean, Rob makes an excellent point there. We need some kind of, in the setting of a public health crisis, once a public health emergency is declared, I think we need something akin to like a DPA-like authority for the conduct of clinical trials, where someone could referee to some degree in the setting of a public health emergency enrollment in clinical trials, and bias enrollment towards trials that are more likely to yield actionable information and are involving products that are more likely to provide a benefit. We ended up doing how many trials with Pepcid and hydroxychloroquine while we couldn't enroll trials for therapeutic antibodies? So there needs to be some more administration there, because in the setting of a public health emergency, clinician time is precious. I mean, it's precious at any point, and patients' willingness to enroll in a clinical trial is precious, and we need to make sure those resources are being used appropriately.
But Matt, your quote took today. We have a public health emergency crisis right now. It's called 500,000 people dying from tobacco-related illness today. What clinical trials are going on to show us how to fix that problem? Almost nothing.
Yeah, very few. I haven't seen one in a few years. So, all right. Well, we're at time. I can go longer with you guys if you want, but I'm assuming you all have other stuff on your calendars. So thank you so much to all of you. I appreciate you being here, and I can see from the chat that everyone else also really appreciates you being here. Both the questions, which I told you not to answer, but not to look at, and the chat are full of effusive remarks. So thank you for that. It was really wonderful. And thanks also to Real Chemistry for sponsoring, formerly known as W2O, who sponsored this event. And to all of you out there, thanks for answering some really great questions. Keep an eye out for our STAT webinar, Future Directions for Cancer Immunotherapy, taking place on March 24th. And also for our weekly STAT Plus conversations and our summits, which are coming up. More information can be found on our website. Be sure to sign in and join us. Until then, stay safe and be well. Thanks, everybody.